All right, well, glad to be here, everyone. I'm Emily Porter, and I'm here with my colleagues Brad Watson and Ayoub Belemlih. Um, and we are from Emory University in the Library Technology and Digital Strategies unit. And we're going to talk about Fedora migration considerations in a Samvera context. So also want to acknowledge all the other Samvera related presentations you may have seen already this week, and hopefully we won't be repeating too much. We're trying to keep this pretty high level, but we also know the details are what are the most interesting things. So to give a little context here, um, this is the Emory Fedora's landscape. We have been using Fedora 3, I think, since about, I think we started, I've got these dates in here that reflect like when the actual software was released. But we originally started working with Fedora 3 at Emory probably around 2009. And we still have applications and content managed, through a Fedora 3 environment. We call these our legacy applications. This was a homegrown framework that was Python and Django based. We have quite a few different Fedora content models. There are approximately 300,000 intellectual objects, so not files, but the intellectual parent objects there. We also have been transitioning to try to get everything into a Samvera-based infrastructure. And we currently have two production Samvera applications, which are using the software called Hyrax, indicated by this lovely creature here. And so what we're really focusing on in this presentation is really thinking about how do we get our Fedora 3 managed content not only into Samvera, but ultimately, we really want to get everything into Samvera with Fedora 6. And so we're very glad that there's work in the community happening. And John Dunn was just presenting about that working group that's coming up. So, there are a couple of pathways here. One is using that Fedora 3 direct to 3 to 6 migration utility. And then there's also another path, which is to kind of get from 3 to 4, then 4 to 5, and 5 to 6. So I am going to hand it off to my colleague Ayoub, who's going to talk a little bit about the framework and some of the considerations we're looking at.
Sounds good. Hi, everyone. My name is Ayoub. I'm a software developer for Emory Libraries. And just a little bit of context, just for anyone who's not as familiar with Samvera and Hyrax. Samvera, also formerly known as Hydra, I believe started back in 2008 with the purpose of building open source digital repository solutions. And in regards to the community origins, it started with the idea of building upon Fedora 3 and focusing on reusable solutions. And among the multiple solutions that Samvera creates, the one that's going to be the focus of this presentation in regards to Fedora is Hyrax. And Hyrax is a Ruby on Rails CRUD interface to Fedora for like preservation and storage, and for Solr, for indexing and discovery. And aside from like the backend that does all of this, there's also like a feature-rich front end supporting deposit, discovery, management of repository assets. And Hyrax is one of several core products developed by the Samvera community, and is the main one that we'll be focusing on in the next slides. Next slide, please, Emily. So in terms of Hyrax and interacting with Fedora, there's really two kind of main ways that you can use, and one predates the other. So the first one is Active Fedora. And Active Fedora started back in 2011, and the idea is it pretty much provides an interface in Rails and Ruby to interact with Fedora 3. And in general, Active Fedora supports both Fedora 3 and Fedora 4 since Fedora's transition to LDP. There were changes to the Fedora implementation to actually support Fedora 4. So both of them are supported officially by Active Fedora. There's some active development in progress to support Fedora 6. for like Samvera products, and most of the development is from the Avalon team, and I'll refer back to this later. And in general, Active Fedora is targeted for deprecation. So the idea is like, if you're using it in your project, you can keep using it, but moving into upgrades into the future, it is targeted for deprecation. The other way of consuming Fedora within a hierarchy repository would be Valkyrie, which started in 2018. And it started with the idea of decoupling hierarchs from Fedora and Solr, so the alternate persistence and indexing backends can be used. For instance, Postgres, and the idea here is that institutions can have a little bit of flexibility with, you know, what systems they want to use for persistence, whether, for instance, they want to use Fedora, or they want to use Postgres. But the idea is, from a development point, as a developer, when you're interacting with Valkyrie, you can pretty much abstract that backend away and deal with one, you know, range of models, one specific set of models. It's a pretty nice abstraction, and we had the opportunity to work and experiment with it in this project. And yeah, the development to formally support Fedora 6 for hierarchs is still in plan, and specifically for Valkyrie, and it's going to happen through the efforts of the hierarchs Fedora 6 working group. And now I'm going to turn it over to Brad to talk a little bit about PCDM.
Hello, I'm Brad Watson. I am a software developer of Emory as well. Can everybody hear and see all of my data in front of me? Great. Okay, so when we are dealing with the data model for hierarchs, we're dealing with the PCDM, which is also known as Portland Common Data Model, which is convenient. We're talking about data models here. And we are also talking about a overlay whenever it comes to hierarchs, also known as Hydra. Basically, all you have to know with what hierarchs does to the data model is that it adds in a couple of has file relationships. So there usually is only one. It extends it out to thumbnail as well as extracted text as well. Just a note for us as a organization, we do customize this a little bit further. We do go ahead and put relationships going backwards to our collections. And we also do go ahead and do a little bit of work with the has file relationships. We do go ahead and look at primary versus secondary files because we do quite a bit of attached files as well. We go ahead. Oh, and if you do want references, we do have the detailed wikis at the bottom of that slide. We go to the next slide. Okay, so with our migration, this is basically an overview, but we were looking to see how the objects came over from Fedora 3. These were non-hierarchs based objects, and we wanted to see what we would have to do to get them into a hierarchs type of model, and we wanted to make sure that with the things we migrated over, that we were able to go ahead and index them into the Solr database to go ahead and have hierarchs read them. And we would also want to make sure how hard that was. So we took the first step, which was to see what Valkyrie could do. Next slide, please. And this is what kind of happened. Yeah. So we did the migration. We basically saw that the objects came over with the binaries as well as with OCFL. They were all extracted to root, which was kind of fun because we knew that hierarchs deals with pair tree. So we were addressing how that was going to work. And so once we got the migrated data, we went ahead and started to use Valkyrie with it. And we basically, you'll see a graphical kind of a situation here, as far as Valkyrie being the winged item, and then hierarchs being the last symbol there. But if we move on to the next slide, you'll see that basically what we have done is we have created a bare bones Ruby on Rails application. We tied it to Valkyrie, and it was pretty easy to interact with objects. It was pretty easy to extract out the data that was within the OCFL into typical fields that Hyrax deals with. We were able to take those kind of molded fields and create subcut of file sets attached to them via association, as Hyrax does. And after all of that work was done, we were able to use Valkyrie in the same sense to create a solar index. There were some fun bits that we found with how Valkyrie did solar indexing. There's multiple fields repeating the same information quite often, which was kind of a quirk, but very interesting. And we were able to basically, I tie this up to a Hyrax instance, plain vanilla. And basically we were able to see search results because of course it's working from Solr. We were able to see works and file sets and all the associated metadata. Unfortunately, we hit a wall whenever it came to persistence, which was expected, which was something that we knew coming in that we were probably going to have the problem there. And whenever we saw the migrated data and looked at our own objects with a Fedora 4, we knew that pair tree was going to be an issue, and that was also the case. But we also found out that binary files are still at its core whenever, let me back up a little bit here. Whenever we use Valkyrie as a Fedora adapter, it is expected that everything wings and therefore active Fedora is turned off. We saw that that was not the case in certain situations. There are still ties to active Fedora, even with wings turned off, which just points to the fact that Hyrax is not yet ready to go ahead and be a Valkyrie Fedora compatible application. And I will switch it back to Ayoub to wrap.
Yeah, so essentially, like once we got into this situation where we were not able to see as much of the persistence that we were hoping to see with works and file sets and other things, with just using Valkyrie and a vanilla Rails application to pretty much, view the data and then use Hyrax to actually try and manipulate that data. We thought, okay, like one alternate way of going at solving this problem could potentially be starting with a vanilla Hyrax application and using active Fedora to actually, read data and create data from and to Fedora 6. And the idea would be that if we manage to get active Fedora to work with Fedora 6 and actually create and read data, then we could potentially use bulk imports through something like Bulkrax to migrate all the data that we currently have at once. And, this was, just setting the stage here, this was literally a very ambitious idea at the time. We had very low expectations because from an active Fedora standpoint, there's no really official support for Fedora 6. So we initially attempted to use like Hyrax with the Wings adapter to persist data to Fedora 6. And we ran into like major incompatibility failures. And that was pretty much, our sign that relying on Valkyrie and Wings with the active Fedora adapter to be able to communicate with Fedora 6 was not going to work. But then, we essentially learned about Chris Lord's work from the Avalon team on creating, like a compatibility branch with Fedora 6. And we started using that branch and those changes. And, against all odds, that proved a lot more successful. And we were able to actually create a functional ingest process with Fedora 6 using active Fedora and Hyrax. And, with despite a few limitations, but I'll go into detail into essentially where we got in the next slide. So just to recap a little bit, our initial goal was to essentially, be able to actually create works, create file sets, attach files. And, we set that as like the major goal to kind of call this prototype to be successful. And everything else we were able to test in terms of compatibility and what's in this matrix. And as you can see, for things like collections, we were able to like it's like a partial success in terms of like we were able to create them at times. We ran into failures, sometimes related to admin sets, sometimes other kind of inconsistent behavior with creating collections, but we were able to create collections and read from them. With the works, which was the main focus, we were able to create, read, and update works using Active Fedora and Fedora 6. With file sets, we were able to create and read them, but we ran into some versioning incompatibilities between Hyrax and Fedora 6, which is why you see like a partial pass for updating file sets. And that's an issue that we kept running into again and again. And with respect to actually preservation and having files persisted, we were able to create and read, and attach the files and read them. So that in that sense, like we're able to get a prototype where with Hyrax, Active Fedora, and Fedora 6, we're able to create entire works with their file sets and files and be able to download and read those files, which was, kind of a major milestone given, our expectations for the prototype. In addition, I just want to touch on a few things, like for instance, with embargoes, we were able to partially create them. And the reason why we're putting partial there is because we were able to make the works private. We were able to see the embargo data in Fedora, but we weren't able to see to view the embargoes on Hyrax itself, which likely suggests it's probably like a Hyrax bug and something that, when the work to make Hyrax fully compatible with Fedora 6 should be solved there. Additionally, with thumbnails, they were the process to create derivatives didn't execute as expected, likely to versioning incompatibilities that we also saw with file sets. And lastly, I'll touch on bulk racks, and we did some testing with bulk racks, but we weren't able to go as far as we wanted given the project timeline, which is why probably as we move further with this solution of using Active Fedora, specifically the feature 6, the Fedora 6 branch from Chris Colvard, with Hyrax and with Fedora 6, we'll probably experiment with bulk racks more then. And yeah, that's pretty much it for the results matrix. I'll turn it over to Emily to talk about OCFL.
Thank you. So my next slide here. Oh, here we go. So going into this, one of the reasons we're very interested in Fedora 6 is to reap the benefits of OCFL and our preservation strategy and all the great things that it offers. But I was very curious to, as we went through this project, make sure that we stopped and looked at the kind of OCFL that was being generated through our different stages of testing. I will also say I am not an OCFL expert, but I happen to work for one. So thank you, Rosalind Metz, for giving me some insights into what I'm going to show you in a minute. So we did take a snapshot immediately after doing one of our migration tests. And I'm glad we did that, because then we can see, and most of our migration utility work was using, mainly default settings. We did a couple of small migrations using just a subset of PIDs. And the resulting output is archival groups. So you have a nice single OCFL object directory structure that contains all the metadata and binary files. This is really nice. But as we've noted before, this does produce a relatively simple structure, very similar to Fedora 3. But Hyrax and also PCDM require, a much different structure. So that was one of the things that we just struggled with throughout this pilot. Another thing I want to mention, and I'm sure those of you who have already migrated to Fedora 6 have fine-tuned your settings and your strategy here, but we did see, even just doing that initial migration pass, we saw a lot of versions getting generated right off the bat. And in kind of digging into this further, we think that this may correlate to the original Fedora 3 audit trail. And in our case, that can indicate edits to metadata, but also storing results of fixity checking over many, many years. So, and one example of this is that one migrated object that had 8 data streams, generated 155 versions immediately off the bat. So all this to say, is something that we're flagging for later. If we want to use this migration utility in the future, we definitely need to have a strategy. I know there are some other options and possibly extensions that we might be able to use to help with that behavior. And so this slide gives me a migraine every time I look at it, but this was a very interesting deep dive to see what happened, what was produced in OCFL when we did that kind of greenfield, start fresh, not using migrated data. What does the OCFL look like when we use Hyrax and active Fedora? So again, I was talking about in the previous slide, the migration is basically one OCFL object per identifier migrated. And this complicated chart here is showing what happened when we created 10 works. This is just 10 objects in Hyrax with 7 binaries attached. And what we got was 245 distinct OCFL objects and also 374 Fedora resources. And these are what I think are called atomic resources. So each thing is getting its own OCFL object and versioning. And that accounts for these Hyrax and PCDM entities, such as works and file sets and access controls. We also have these proxy objects that come into play for ordering, say, groups of files or ordering other types of things. But you can kind of see from the chart here, the blue pie wedge is, binary files. The red one is works. But there's a whole lot of other stuff that's getting generated through this Hyrax creation process. And I would also mention too, we used the Fedora statistics API to help inform some of this. And in some cases, we can kind of figure out what a given container is based on its namespace. In other cases, we're kind of having to do manual analysis of the OCFL root and just trying to find patterns and RDF namespaces that would help us understand what these things are. But I think it was something like 360 out of those 374 Fedora resources are some type of just container. And clearly the actual content is a very small subset of this. So all this to say, this is not an optimal use of OCFL, in my opinion. And I think it's something that the Hyrax and Fedora 6 working groups should think about very carefully. Also, I'm not sure if Tom Roble is still on the call, but we've definitely had some very interesting conversations with the Oxford team about this kind of problem. So what is our path forward? We allocated time in our migration pilot and the project to really think about, we've got to stop testing, even though we could have tested for a long time, and just really think about what this means. We do have a production project scheduled that we need to try to wrap up in the next year. So we went through a number of pros and cons and thinking about different strategies and what we want to do. We would like to continue forward with Hyrax and Fedora 6, again, for one of those Fedora 3 collections. And this really all is going to be contingent upon where things are with the community. I would also mention, I know some of what we reported on with our Valkyrie testing, there's active development sprints going on right now with Valkyrie, which may resolve some of the issues that we ran into. But whether or not we're using Valkyrie or active Fedora is really going to depend on how far along the community is and what we think we can contribute to help resolve some of the issues that we found. And then again, what I was just talking about, but thinking about how to best leverage and also manage OCFL, especially when it comes to versions. The other thing that we're thinking about is instead of using the migration utility where we did extract, load, and transform, really going back to more of an extract, transform, and re-ingest type approach, because there's so many entities and data requirements for hierarchs, that doing a re-ingest may be the best way to get support there. We also have, in some cases, data streams that we don't actually want to migrate, and we may have to do some massaging of our persistent identifiers. So that is looking like the best path for us. And then, of course, the three of us will be involved in the Hierarchs Fedora 6 working group, and we hope to see others of you there. So I'm going to stop here and say thank you to various folks who have helped us, particularly great support from Fedora 6 folks and also in the Samvera community and our teams at home. So I know Brad and I are on Fedora Slack, and then all three of us are on Samvera Slack, but we've got our email addresses here as well.
Thank you so much, Emily, Brad, and Ayoub. We do have some time for questions, so we can take them again in the chat. You can just unmute, raise a hand, whatever you need. Got a few minutes. All right, well, as Emily mentioned, her and Brad are both in Fedora Slack, and everybody is in the Samvera Slack, so please feel free to reach out either in the chat here if you have questions as you think of them, or in any of the Slack channels. Oh, Josh, you had a question.
Yeah, sorry. So hi, I'm Josh Westgard. I'm at the University of Maryland in College Park. I was hesitating to ask a question. I did come in halfway through, so always hesitate then. But since nobody else had a question,
We appreciate it. Thank you.
Very interesting what I was able to hear, and I'm wondering about all those the graph you showed with all the, all those unknown kind of OCFL objects that are getting created. Are those like? I assume this is by number of resources and not by size on the disk.
Correct.
Right?
Yeah, this is
these undetermined ones are probably like tiny. But
yes, and
considering your
yeah, and it would have been really difficult to try to demo that or show it, but I'd be happy to share samples of what some of these things look like. So they're just little tiny OCFL objects with a version 1 and a that FCR description file that's just basically, a couple of triples with namespaces in it. So it's really hard to figure out what those are,
right?
Why they got created, and if they're serving any purpose.
I mean, hopefully, as we as a community can come up with a solution to clean that out, because I don't think we should just live with.
No, we don't want this, and this is just for 10 works, so that's 374 resources. You can imagine doing a large migration, the amount of extraneous objects that are getting created. And also I think that may in part, if in fact this, which I think this is fairly similar to what happens with hierarchs in Fedora 4, may contribute to some performance issues that we've experienced in the past.
Thank you.
I'm going to take Rosalind. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, Josh. Rosalind was up next.
So I do want to say to with my OCFL hat on, when Emily sort of walked me through the objects, the concern I had is it looked like all of these different things should be together, right? Like if you're thinking intellectually about an object, you don't want the binaries to live over here and the whatever metadata you're attaching over here and the access controls over here, because how would you ever bring it together, right? You really want to try to bring it together. And what I said to Emily was, this is sort of the refrain, and actually seeing that Thomas is raising his hand, and in the OCFL listening session just now, one of the refrains that we're as editors hearing is like, well, oh, now we have to think about how we structure our objects. And I think the way Fedora 4 was, it was in some respects that was opaque, right? Because of mode shape and all that stuff. That being said, this isn't a Fedora concern because we have the same conversations with people that are not even using Fedora, just off in the universe. Like, what is an object? And OCFL has a very loose definition. It's the content and the administrative information. But like, what is your definition of an object, right? Like if you think about premise has a definition of that a single file is an object. I don't have that definition because I disagree with premise. As Emily's laughing because I disagree with premise and we'll tell you about it all day. But I think it's still, that doesn't mean that I don't think that's a valid object, right? It's just, what do you think an object is? And OCFL doesn't necessarily tell you that.